The Second World War ended in flames, treaties, and trials, but hidden within the silence of locked vaults are stories that were never meant to see daylight. Classified reports, erased communiques, vanished reels of film, and secret negotiations conducted under the smoke of burning cities. These fragments of truth have surfaced like ghosts from a war most believe they already understand. The title that guides us today, WWII Files That Could Rewrite History Forever, is not sensationalism, but a warning. These are not rumors whispered in taverns or fantasies scribbled in conspiratorial pamphlets. They are files, stamped with official seals, stamped with the ink of governments, and stamped with the intent to bury them, until the men who knew them were long dead. Yet they remain, seeping into the public record with the quiet force of something undeniable. What follows is not a tale of battlefield heroics, nor polished history written for classrooms. It is the residue of war, secrets traded in corridors lit by a single bulb, agreements written on thin paper and then shredded into silence. 4 files, 4 shadows in the archives, each carrying the weight of decisions that shaped nations and cost untold lives. To read them is to trespass on forbidden ground. Chapter 1. The Classified Surrender That Never Happened. In the final months of the war in Europe, as the Reich collapsed under the relentless advance of Allied armies, documents now surfaced reveal that another war played out in the shadows. One fought with whispers, signatures and double dealings behind locked embassy doors. The file is stamped with a chilling directive. Operation Eclipse, for eyes only. Its contents describe a sequence of meetings and intercepted cables suggesting that Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS and one of the most feared men of the Third Reich, attempted to carve out a separate peace with the Western Allies months before Berlin was reduced to rubble. According to fragments of OSS transcripts retrieved from Stockholm, Sweden, in March 1945, Himmler dispatched envoys carrying coded documents to negotiate with American intelligence officers. The promise was chillingly straightforward: a partial surrender of German forces on the Western Front in exchange for immunity from prosecution and an alliance against the advancing Soviet armies. The atmosphere at this point in the war was one of chaos and desperation. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River and stood less than 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler, increasingly isolated in the Führerbunker, ranted about betrayal and final annihilation, while his inner circle fractured under the strain of defeat. Yet Himmler, master of survival and deception, saw opportunity. Newly uncovered OSS memos describe meetings held under neutral covers in Stockholm safe houses, with codenames assigned to both German and American intermediaries. Eagle and Crown, the pseudonyms for 2 senior OSS officers, disappeared from official duty logs during this exact period. Their names, once common in post-war military service records, abruptly vanish after March 1945, as though erased deliberately from history. British intelligence, meanwhile, intercepted fragments of cable traffic referencing these contacts. A memo attributed to the Special Operations Executive, dated March 23, 1945, and marked severe risk, deny everything, records Churchill's frustration. He suspected American intelligence of playing a dangerous double game, one that could fracture Allied unity at the very moment of victory. The British were unwilling to allow Himmler any leverage. They had seen his role in orchestrating the Holocaust, the machinery of concentration camps, the ruthless suppression of occupied territories. To imagine him negotiating for survival was intolerable. Yet to the Americans, particularly the more pragmatic officers of the OSS, the thought of harnessing German divisions against Stalin's Red Army may have appeared tempting. If these documents are to be believed, the proposal involved halting German resistance in the Ruhr pocket, thereby allowing American forces a cleaner advance into central Germany. In return, Himmler demanded safe passage and protection from prosecution, not only for himself, but for select SS officers deemed valuable in the coming struggle against the Soviets. The files list specific names including Waffen-SS generals and even administrators tied directly to occupied Poland. The OSS records note chillingly, "Subject insists, survival essential. In exchange promises to redeploy Wehrmacht remnants eastward." What makes these files disturbing is not only the existence of such discussions, but the possibility that partial implementation occurred. Records from Szeth, the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, show inexplicable gaps in German resistance in late March. American divisions advancing through Western, Germany encountered surrendering units, often with intact equipment, long before official orders for capitulation were issued in May. While some of this can be attributed to war fatigue, historians now question whether these surrenders were coordinated gestures tied to Himmler's clandestine overtures. The Soviets, for their part, sensed duplicity. Stalin's dispatches to Roosevelt and Churchill bristled with suspicion. He accused the Western Allies of preparing a second front, not against Germany, but against the Soviet Union. At Yalta, in February, the leaders had pledged unity. Yet by March, with the Red Army poised to claim Berlin, the temptation of reshaping post-war Europe through secret deals became dangerously real. This explains, perhaps, Stalin's unyielding determination to seize Berlin at all costs, regardless of casualties. He knew that whoever raised their flag over the Reichstag would dictate not just Germany's future, but the geopolitical order to come. The files also reveal the abrupt termination of Operation Eclipse. By early April, as Himmler's betrayal of Hitler became evident and his authority disintegrated, the Americans cut ties. A final OSS cable from Stockholm reads, "Source compromised. Subject unreliable. Terminate contact." Days later, Himmler was expelled from Hitler's inner circle, attempting to save himself through new negotiations with Count Volker Bernadotte in Denmark, which also failed. In May, captured by British forces, Himmler bit into a cyanide capsule rather than face trial. Yet the lingering question remains: how much of his proposal had already been absorbed into Allied conduct? Why did certain Wehrmacht divisions on the Western Front collapse so quickly, while others fought to the death against the Soviets? Was this simply the chaos of a defeated army, or the shadow of a bargain never openly acknowledged? For decades, the official record has denied any such attempt at collaboration. The Nuremberg trials condemned Himmler posthumously as the architect of genocide, not as a negotiator of secret peace. But the fragments of Operation Eclipse, preserved in declassified files and intelligence leaks, suggest otherwise. If true, this buried episode reveals that the closing chapter of the war was shaped not only by battlefield valor or diplomatic conferences, but by the cold logic of clandestine power. It hints at an alliance that nearly materialized between the sworn enemies of democracy and fascism against a common Soviet foe. It suggests that beneath the triumphant narratives of liberation and unconditional surrender lay a darker truth, that survival, betrayal, and the shifting sands of geopolitics dictated choices too dangerous to acknowledge. And it forces us to ask, if the victors themselves suppressed this knowledge, what else was buried with it? For in the hidden corridors of Stockholm, under the codename Eclipse, the war might have ended differently. Not with the roar of Soviet artillery in Berlin, but with a whispered pact that history could never admit. Chapter 2. The Erased Atrocities of Unit 731. On the frozen plains of Manchuria, far from the Western Front and the eyes of Allied journalists, a nightmare was constructed brick by brick. It bore the bureaucratic name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, a sprawling complex of laboratories, prison cells and crematoriums near the city of Harbin. Behind its gates between 1936 and 1945, some of the most grotesque crimes of the Second World War unfolded. And yet, for decades after Japan's surrender, the full record of these atrocities was buried, not to shield Tokyo, but to serve the military ambitions of Washington. Unit 731 was commanded by General Shiro Ishii, a man whose polished manners and medical credentials masked a cold ruthlessness. He was not a fringe figure, but a decorated officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, entrusted with developing weapons that could tilt the balance of global power. Witness testimony describes how Ishii oversaw experiments with plague, cholera, anthrax, and frostbite. Prisoners, Chinese civilians, captured Soviets, and even Allied POWs were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, deliberately infected with deadly diseases, or exposed to freezing temperatures to study tissue death. Survivors were not released. They were disposed of, their remains incinerated in the unit's furnaces. Each experiment was carefully recorded, not for sadism alone, but for what Ishii called data of national importance. By 1945, as Japan braced for defeat, Ishii ordered the destruction of Unit 731's main facilities. Prisoners were executed, laboratories dismantled, documents burned. Yet not everything was lost. Soviet troops, sweeping through Manchuria in August, captured surviving staff and fragments of records. At the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949, Soviet prosecutors laid out harrowing evidence of biological warfare tests. Witnesses described plague-infested fleas released over Chinese villages, poisoned wells, and deliberate epidemics unleashed against civilian populations. Testimonies included the names of doctors, the details of research programs, and direct orders traced back to Ishii himself. For Moscow, this was a chance to expose the crimes of Japanese militarism and to implicate the West in concealing them. But in Washington, a different calculation was made. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, the hub of America's biological warfare program, senior officers saw in Ishii's research an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Classified memos between General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters and U.S. Army intelligence in 1947 reveal a chilling decision. Instead of prosecuting Unit 731 personnel in the Tokyo trials, American authorities offered immunity in exchange for exclusive access to their findings. A document stamped "Top Secret, Joint Chiefs of Staff" states, "The value of data is incalculable. Immediate public disclosure would compromise national security interests." Thus, Ishii and many of his subordinates walked free, living comfortable lives in post-war Japan. Some even ascended to prestigious university and government positions. The deal was hidden not only from the global public, but also from many within the Allied ranks. At Nuremberg, the United States helped prosecute Nazi doctors who had conducted medical experiments in Dachau and Ravensbrück. Yet no Japanese equivalent faced similar judgment. Instead, the crimes of Unit 731 were officially erased from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal record. Survivors who sought justice found silence. Families who lost relatives in Manchuria were told their stories lacked evidence. The archives remained sealed, and those who spoke too loudly were dismissed as propagandists echoing Soviet narratives. Soviet intelligence, however, never forgot. Files declassified after 1991 reveal that Stalin's agencies were aware of the immunity deal, fueling their distrust of Washington in the early Cold War. They knew that the United States had obtained Ishii's plague and anthrax data, and they suspected that this knowledge fed into secret programs at Fort Detrick. In effect, the biological warfare race of the 1950s was built not only on American innovation, but on atrocities committed in hidden cells in Manchuria. What makes this file so disturbing is the cold logic that justified the bargain. American strategists argued that the data, collected under conditions unreplicable in ethical laboratory practice, could save years of research and potentially thousands of American lives should a future war break out with the Soviet Union. But this meant that the deaths of thousands of innocents, men, women, and children dissected alive, were retroactively legitimized as useful. The paper trail does not disguise this reality. One memorandum from 1948 bluntly states, "The ends justify the means." The victims were of enemy nationality. That line, once hidden in a locked cabinet, speaks volumes about the moral compromises embedded in post-war strategy. The echoes of Unit 731 extended beyond the archives. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean officials accused the United States of deploying biological weapons, citing testimony from Japanese veterans of Unit 731 who allegedly assisted in operations. Washington denied these claims, dismissing them as communist propaganda. But Soviet and Chinese intelligence reports, though never fully corroborated, suggest a disturbing continuity, that the knowledge gained from Ishii's laboratories may have been tested again, under new skies, against new enemies. For the survivors and their descendants, justice never came. When Japan normalized relations with China in the 1970s, references to Unit 731 were carefully downplayed for diplomatic convenience. Lawsuits brought by victims in the 1990s were rejected by Japanese courts, which acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 but denied state responsibility for reparations. The immunity granted by American intelligence had ensured not only Ishii's survival, but the survival of silence. Today, fragments of the record exist in archives across Washington, Tokyo, and Moscow. In 2003, Japan's Ministry of Health admitted to destroying official records on Unit 731 in the 1950s. Yet enough documents leaked through the cracks to reveal the scale of what occurred. The Khabarovsk transcripts, once derided as communist fabrications, have since been confirmed by independent research. Diaries of former soldiers, unearthed in Japanese attics, corroborate the experiments. Even US intelligence reports, now declassified, confirm the immunity deal. The truth, denied for half a century, emerges piece by piece. Unit 731 is not merely a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a reminder that the line between victor and vanquished, between justice and expediency, can blur when power is at stake. The atrocities committed in Manchuria were monstrous, but the choice to erase them, to hide them in order to advance military supremacy, is equally monstrous. The file forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the post-war order, often celebrated as a triumph of democracy and justice, was built in part on bargains struck with the perpetrators of inhuman crimes. And the price was silence. Silence that lasted decades. Silence that allowed the perpetrators to live free. And silence that continues to haunt the survivors who were never heard. Chapter 3. Hidden Soviet footage of Dresden bombing. In February 1945, the city of Dresden stood as one of the last cultural jewels of a collapsing Reich. Known for its Baroque architecture, its opera houses, and its galleries, Dresden was a city often described as the Florence on the Elbe. But within 3 days, from February 13th to 15th, Allied bombers reduced it to smouldering ruins. Flames consumed entire neighborhoods, and tens of thousands perished in what would become one of the most controversial episodes of the war. For decades, the narrative was simple. Dresden had no major military significance, and the bombing was an act of devastating retribution against Germany. Yet among the forgotten archives of the Soviet Union, a set of reels surfaced that challenged that very story. The files were labeled Object 47 and discovered in Moscow in 1991 after the Soviet collapse. They contain aerial footage of Dresden, captured not by the Allies, but by Soviet operatives on the ground and in the air. The reels are meticulous, documenting not just the devastation of the firestorm, but the targets themselves. Unlike the official Western narrative, which insisted the raid was indiscriminate, Soviet annotations on the film suggest otherwise. Key industrial sites are marked. The Zeiss Icon optical works, the Globus electrical plant, and railway junctions critical for transporting war material. More disturbing still are references to suspected facilities tied to Nazi nuclear research. A small network of laboratories, rumored to have links with uranium processing, appear repeatedly in the margins of Soviet intelligence notes. To the Soviets, Dresden was not simply a civilian city. It was a hub of hidden military potential, and its destruction was a calculated strike to deny Germany, and possibly the West, access to advanced weapons. Western officials, however, told a different story. In March 1945, the British Air Ministry issued a statement describing the Dresden raids as part of a campaign to disrupt German communications and weaken enemy morale. For decades, the image of Dresden as a cultural treasure, needlessly obliterated, dominated public consciousness. Writers and historians pointed to the bombing as excessive, perhaps even a war crime. But the Soviet reels, buried for nearly half a century, reveal a darker possibility, that both East and West had reasons to obscure the truth. The annotations indicate not only industrial targets, but also precise strike patterns consistent with coordinated intelligence. The suggestion is clear. This was not merely terror bombing. It was a joint calculation, one in which both Allied and Soviet interests converged, and later, both sides had incentives to suppress. British memos declassified in the late 1970s support this suspicion. An internal paper from the Air Ministry dated February 28, 1945, includes the line, "Additional justification for Dresden strikes must not be discussed in open channels." The wording is vague, but its intent is chilling. If Dresden was destroyed not only to break German resistance, but also to erase sensitive facilities before the Soviets could seize them, then the narrative of indiscriminate destruction served as a convenient cover story. It allowed both sides to frame the tragedy as an unfortunate byproduct of total war, rather than a deliberate act of strategic denial. The Soviet films themselves are haunting. Grainy black and white images show Dresden before the raids, with its ornate skyline intact. The camera lingers on the Elbe River bridges, on train yards bustling with traffic, on clusters of factories just outside the old city. Later reels show the aftermath: vast fields of ash, smoking craters, corpses laid in rows across charred streets. A voiceover, identified in Soviet transcripts as belonging to an NKVD officer, notes, "The enemy city is no more. Military objects neutralized. Civilian toll unmeasured." The coldness of the phrasing mirrors the detachment found in countless wartime reports. Yet in its bureaucratic brevity lies an admission. The civilian toll was known, but disregarded. Historians who have studied Object 47 argue that its existence explains lingering anomalies. Why did Stalin press so urgently for Dresden's destruction at the Yalta Conference just days before the bombing? Why did Churchill later distance himself, calling the raid a matter for future debate? Why did official Allied documents emphasize morale while private memos hint at precision objectives? The Soviet reels, though fragmentary, provide missing pieces. They suggest that Dresden's annihilation was not simply an act of vengeance, but a preemptive strike against knowledge and assets, too dangerous to fall into enemy hands, even if that enemy was also an ally. What followed was decades of silence. The Cold War ensured that neither Washington nor Moscow had any interest in reopening the Dresden question. For the Soviets, admitting they had advanced knowledge and perhaps even coordination would undermine their propaganda narrative of Allied barbarity. For the West, acknowledging that Dresden housed research linked to atomic or advanced weaponry risked exposing the selective morality of total war. Thus, the story of Dresden was allowed to calcify. A tragedy of excess, regrettable but strategically justified. The deeper motives remained buried in sealed vaults and mislabeled reels. When Object 47 emerged in the 1990s, scholars and journalists struggled to authenticate it. Some dismissed the footage as Soviet fabrication. Others, comparing it with Allied aerial reconnaissance, confirmed its consistency. What could not be denied was its existence and the unsettling questions it raised. If Dresden was targeted in part because of intelligence about advanced research, then history's most infamous firebombing was not a senseless act, but a calculated choice, one agreed upon silently by both sides. And if both sides had incentives to suppress this truth, then the entire post-war narrative of Dresden may have been constructed on deliberate omissions. To stand before the ruins of Dresden today, rebuilt but scarred, is to confront more than the memory of loss. It is to confront the possibility that the destruction was not simply a symbol of war's cruelty, but of war's secrecy. The reels in Object 47 whisper a story neither East nor West wanted told. That in the ruins of Dresden lay the intersection of military ambition, nuclear possibility, and the politics of silence. It was easier to let the world believe in indiscriminate firebombing than to reveal the deeper calculus of intelligence and denial. And so, for half a century, the flames of Dresden burned not only in the city's streets, but in the pages of hidden archives, waiting for someone to open them. Chapter 4. Forbidden Pact of Operation Sunrise. In the spring of 1945, as the Reich spiraled toward collapse, the war's endgame played out not only on the front lines, but in neutral Switzerland. Among declassified diplomatic cables lies evidence of a disturbing convergence, codenamed Operation Sunrise. Officially, it was the negotiation of German surrender in northern Italy. Unofficially, it was something darker. A pact between American intelligence and SS officials that blurred the line between justice and expediency. The hidden file, marked Document V12, reveals that behind the facade of capitulation, a secret agreement granted safe passage to selected Nazis in exchange for the surrender of entire Wehrmacht divisions. Passenger lists, erased from Swiss border archives after April 29, 1945, and OSS flights routed through Lisbon, point to an unsettling truth. The war's end was also the beginning of Nazi survival networks, facilitated not by fugitives acting in desperation, but by Allied intelligence acting with precision. The key figure was SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief representative in Italy, and one of the highest-ranking SS officers to survive the war. Wolff, seeking to save himself from certain execution, entered into secret negotiations with Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern. Dulles, who would later become director of the CIA, saw Wolff's offer as a means to end the war in Italy swiftly, sparing Allied soldiers from protracted Alpine battles. But Wolff's demands extended beyond military surrender. According to cables in the V12 file, Wolff insisted on safe passage for high-value Nazis and their families, many of whom later surfaced in Argentina and other parts of South America. Argentine intelligence records discovered decades later refer cryptically to the sunrise guests, a term now linked to these very negotiations. The timing was critical. In April 1945, while Soviet armies closed in on Berlin, Allied forces pushed north through Italy. Every day mattered. Yet these secret negotiations enraged Moscow. Stalin, already convinced that the West sought to cut a separate peace with Germany, saw Operation Sunrise as proof of betrayal. Soviet envoys bombarded Washington and London with demands for inclusion in the talks. Their exclusion only deepened Stalin's suspicion, laying one more brick in the wall of mistrust that would harden into the Cold War. Churchill and Roosevelt, though briefed in fragments, distanced themselves from the operational details, allowing Dulles and his contacts to operate in a grey zone where legality and morality blurred. The files point to a shocking omission. Passenger manifests from flights leaving Switzerland in early May 1945 are missing from official records. Yet parallel documents from Portuguese customs officers reference special diplomatic cargo arriving in Lisbon aboard unmarked OSS aircraft. Within weeks, German nationals carrying false identities arrived in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Santiago. These names later appeared in Argentine security dossiers, cross-referenced with known SS officers. The paper trail suggests these were not random escapes via rat lines established after the war, but orchestrated transfers, deliveries sanctioned under the umbrella of Operation Sunrise. Karl Wolff himself benefited directly. Captured by the Allies, he was sentenced to a relatively mild prison term, serving only part of his sentence before being released in 1969. He lived quietly in Germany, giving interviews that carefully avoided mention of Sunrise's darker dimensions. Dulles, meanwhile, ascended to power, shaping the Cold War order as director of the CIA. Neither man had an incentive to reveal the true extent of their bargain. Both saw themselves as pragmatists, men who traded moral purity for geopolitical advantage. But for the victims of Nazi terror, this pragmatism meant justice denied. Swiss involvement is another troubling layer. Neutral Switzerland, already criticized for its banking relationships with the Third Reich, served as the conduit for Sunrise. The V12 file contains cables from Swiss diplomats acknowledging border crossings that were not to be recorded. The secrecy was absolute, with instructions to destroy communications after transmission. That these orders survived at all is a testament to the uneven chaos of archival destruction. Yet they paint a picture of deliberate collusion, where neutrality became a mask for complicity. Soviet anger was not misplaced. Operation Sunrise foreshadowed the Cold War by revealing how quickly the West's priorities shifted from defeating fascism to containing communism. To Washington, select Nazis were not irredeemable criminals, but potential assets in the looming confrontation with Moscow. Scientists, intelligence officers, and military strategists, men whose hands were stained with blood, were reclassified as useful and given new identities under programs that paralleled Sunrise. Project Paperclip brought German scientists to the United States. Sunrise offered escape routes to others. Together, they revealed that the post-war order was less about punishing all war criminals and more about choosing which ones to recycle. For decades, Operation Sunrise was remembered only as a clever piece of diplomacy that hastened the end of war in Italy. Yet Document V12 forces us to reconsider. The war did not end with unconditional surrender, as the official story insists. It ended with negotiations, compromises, and covert deals that ensured the survival of men who should have faced justice. It ended with flights into Lisbon, erased border records, and Sunrise guests disembarking in South America. And it ended with Stalin's fury, setting the stage for half a century of suspicion and confrontation. The forbidden pact of Operation Sunrise is more than a footnote. It is a case study in how the victors of war, while celebrating triumph, were already shaping a new conflict. It demonstrates that beneath the rhetoric of justice and liberation, decisions were made that betrayed both the dead and the living. For if the war was won in May 1945, it was also in the shadows of Swiss chalets and OSS offices the moment a new war was born. The flames of fascism were not extinguished. They were carried, under false names and diplomatic seals, across oceans, where they would smolder into the next age. The war that remade the 20th century did not end cleanly, nor did it end fully. It ended with bombed cities, surrender ceremonies, and trials at Nuremberg, but it also ended with files hidden in vaults, reels of film labeled only with numbers, and agreements scribbled in code names. 4. WWII files that could rewrite history forever is not a list of rumors. It is a ledger of buried truths. Each document tells us that history is not fixed. It is managed, censored, and sometimes erased. Himmler's secret overtures to the West, Unit 731's immunity deal, Soviet footage of Dresden, and the forbidden pact of Operation Sunrise all converge on the same lesson: that the victors wrote the story, but the archives still whisper another version. These files remind us that beneath the triumphal speeches of 1945 lay fear, betrayal, and pragmatic bargains made in silence. And they leave us with a question that will never rest easy. If these 4 files surfaced only decades later, how many more remain hidden, locked in steel drawers, waiting for the day they can no longer be denied?